الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت يا حي يا قيوم تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا. اللهم اجعل جمعنا هذا جمعا مرحوما واجعل تفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما ولا تجعل فينا ولا منا شقيا ولا محروما برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Dear brothers and sisters, I welcome you to tonight's event. The title for tonight's discussion is End of Life, Journey to the Other Side. Alhamdulillah, we have two people who are going to be on a panel tonight, and I will be moderating the discussion. I am your brother, Arsalan Haq, serving the Islamic Association of Collin County as their scholar in residence. And with me, I have my two esteemed panelists. I'm going to go ahead and quickly introduce them to you. First, we have with us our dear sister Sandra Labadia, and mashallah, she is a very qualified individual, and there's a lot that I can say about her, but just to be brief, Sister Sandra is a licensed professional social worker and chaplain. She has a bachelor's in social work from Columbia College. She has a master's in social work from University of Missouri, and she's currently doing a graduate leadership program in theology at Hartford Seminary. She's worked as a chaplain for Heart to Heart Hospice, UTSW, UT Southwestern Medical Center, and Methodist Dallas Healthcare System from 2012 to 2017. She's also worked as a therapist for TSSNT, that's Trauma Support Services of North Texas. Sister Sandra has ministered pastoral care, spiritual support, bereavement counseling, and trauma counseling to patients, families, and staff during emergency crises and end-of-life care. And as a chaplain, she's often the bridge of communication between patients, their families, and the medical team. She has facilitated patient care teams to assist families in emergency crisis situations, and she has administered procedures for end-of-life issues, which include obtaining notarized advance directives or medical power of attorney for families. So Sister Sandra will be speaking, and we also have, of course, our own resident Imam, Imam Azhar Subedar, the resident Imam here at the Islamic Association of Collin County, and he does not need an introduction. So inshallah ta'ala, with that, I'm going to ask Sister Sandra if she could speak for a little bit, and also Imam Azhar to chime in. And then at the end of our discussion, inshallah, we will also entertain questions from the audience. So I encourage people who are watching on Facebook Live or on YouTube to submit their questions in the comment section, and then I will ask those questions to our panelists whenever I get a chance. Jazakumullah khair. Sister Sandra, please, bismillah.
Yes, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Brother Arslan, for your introduction. I appreciate it so much. And I thank you, Zeba, for coordinating this program, and for Imam Azhar for initiating such an important program in our community. I think this is a much needed dialogue dialogue that needs to continue to happen about how we're going to care for our Muslims, brothers and sisters in a non-Muslim country, and how to create a space for Muslims to die in that provides the comfort and care that they need, to be with professionals who are Muslim, and to be surrounded by Muslims who understand how important this critical care is at the end of our life. I wanted to address some of the questions that Imam Azhar had sent me about the DNR. I created a small presentation for this evening, just so that we have a baseline to work from of some of the important questions that you might need, terminology that you might not be aware of or that you should be aware of, that is necessary in the current crisis situation. One of the terminologies is called a DNR. This is do not resuscitate. It is a measure that you can put in place, and we have an option of putting this in place for patients, particularly who are elderly, because when they are in a end of life care, you'll find that the time legally, from a legal perspective, we have to resuscitate every patient in the hospital. So when you have a DNR in place, this removes the responsibility from a family and to make a decision. And when you're an elderly, either has a stroke or a heart attack, it will be often that if they're elderly, the pressure from the pressure from resuscitating will sometimes break the ribs of the elderly patient. So when you're elderly, you want to put a DNR in place. When you're younger, you may not, but it's a life-saving measure that is, from a legal perspective, they will always take the precedent over any patient in the hospital. So this is one of the terminologies. I don't know if you're going to show the slide presentation or if I should go from and.
Inshallah, Sister Sandra, thank you so much. That's exactly what we're looking forward to, inshallah, is for you as an expert in this field to facilitate for us as a community, many of whom, including myself, are ignorant of not just the terminologies, but the Islamic perspective and also the legal perspective of what needs to be done in the 11th hour of a crisis. And once again, as you stated before, we are living in a very peculiar time where knowledge of such is important, and it's imperative for us to have, because none of us know if we're going to either end up in the hospital or we are going to have a loved one end up in the hospital. And as we were discussing before you coming on, and for our viewers coming on tonight, was under the current circumstances, family members are not allowed access to the patients in the hospital, especially those who've been diagnosed with COVID. So once a family member enters the hospital, if they don't exit from it alive and they exit from it to a morgue, family members don't have a chance to be with them in their final moments. So assalamu alaikum to all our community members, from myself, and we want to thank you all for joining us. And inshallah, Sister Sandra, if you want, you can present that presentation. If not, we can have it pulled up by the staff, inshallah, for you to then go through with us. Do you have that accessible with you, Sister Sandra, right now?
Yes.
You can share it on the screen, inshallah, and you can go through it according to the method that you feel comfortable doing so, inshallah.
Do you have that? Does Zaid is showing that on your screen, or is it just?
It could show on your screen too. You just have to pull it up, inshallah. I don't have.
Sister Sandra, if you're not able to pull it up, let me know and I can do that for you, inshallah.
Let me see if I have it here.
Please, would you do that on your end?
Okay, inshallah. Go ahead and I'll pull it up and I'll put it up, inshallah.
So I have it here. If you want, we could start off. Is that okay?
Yeah. But for some reason, I'm not.
Okay, let me just share my screen here, Sister Sandra. And
so not to lose the moment, I wanted to share that across the nation, there's lots of new procedures in place. For one of the, a lot of the new technology for chaplaincy is telechaplaincy, and they are not allowing in some states such as Wisconsin, Louisiana, Tennessee, Arkansas. They're not allowing chaplains to go into the hospitals to meet with patients or serve patients, the only option you have is to do a teletherapy. You could possibly do a video
Correct.
a call or Skype or FaceTime.
Mhm.
This is the style that they're offering, and the hospitals here in Texas have a different dynamic. They're allowing priests to go in to Baylor, into UT Southwestern, into Clemens, and some chaplains are working out of these hospitals. For example, Clemens, they are allowing chaplains to go in, and they're allowing chaplains to see patients.
And
So,
Sister Sandra, while you're explaining this to the viewers, I just want to kind of chime in, if you don't mind. Many people may be questioning, what does it mean for a priest or a chaplain or someone to come in? Well, when we go to the hospital, if anyone is admitted into the hospital, they have a right. And Sister Sandra, please interject whenever you feel comfortable doing so. You have the right to request for a person of your faith or a person of faith to come and pray for you, to speak with you. And many a times in the hospitals here, also in Texas, you can request for an imam, and they will call on an imam. Alhamdulillah, here for the Plano area, I've been designated for Baylor Scott. So whenever there is a patient in the heart hospital, they would call me if that is requested by the patient. So the first thing I think we need to understand as a community, that services are provided based on our individual requests. So if you are in a hospital visiting a patient, you see a priest walking around or going to a room and praying with someone, you may have this mindset that how come some people get preferential treatment and not others? The answer is simple. It's not preferential treatment. It's a service that's provided. And you as a patient, a family member as a patient, have the right to ask for that service to be provided. And they will then reach out to the person of that particular faith to pray for the individual, to speak with the individual, to give counseling or guidance to the individual. And as Sister Sandra just said, in the era that we're in right now, telemedicine is kind of the primary way that this service is provided. Sister Sandra?
yes, exactly. And so what's happening is, if you don't, or your family doesn't speak on your behalf and put your name on a list, then you're not allowed to actually be seen. They have, across the board in Texas, they allow one family member per day.
Mhm.
And this is, and then they also have to be registered on your list in Epic, which is a record key, the records where they have your medical information, and you have to list the people in your family. You can have just two people who can rotate, but only one person can come a day. And once they leave, they can't come back. And if you list that you have an imam or a priest or a rabbi to come, then they will give permission. But if they're not on that list that you have in the hospital, then they will not be allowed to see the patient. So this is critical. Families, for example, in Methodist, they are allowing 3 people to come if you die, and to see the decedent, but they cannot come all at the same time into the room. They will let one come in, and when that one leaves, the other can go in, and they have to rotate. At Clemens, they 5 people to go in, and we had a family that had 6 children, and they had to choose only 5
Mhm.
of the children who can go in to see.
And again,
decedent.
Sister Sandra, this is exactly the reality when it comes to even janazas. Initially, when COVID was hitting a peak, the Rahma Funeral Home here would only permit up to 10 individuals for the janaza prayer. Janaza prayer was being done outside. It was not being done in any masjid. So again, just to highlight to our listeners and our viewers that this is the current status and the current state of affairs is what Sister Sandra is telling us, that the many different hospitals here in our area have different protocols and those protocols differ based on which hospital you go to. And as Sister Sandra just said, the different hospitals here that she named have different numbers of patients, of relatives that are allowed. And also, as she stated, only if the imam or chaplain or anyone, and here we're talking to the Muslim community, so the imam that you're requesting, if they are on the list, only then will they reach out to that imam.
Exactly.
If I can interject and ask a question to continue this discussion. Sister Sandra, you spoke a little bit earlier about how it is required by law for medical professionals to try to resuscitate unless there is a DNR in place. Can both you and Imam Azhar, can you speak a little bit more about DNR orders? So what is a DNR? What does it entail? Is there something such as a partial DNR? And if Imam Azhar, especially if you could chime in and tell us from an Islamic Shari'i perspective, is this something that Muslims should have in place or should not have in place? What should they do?
Thank you. And Sister Sandra, I'd like you first. Let's move the slide here. So this is what Sister Sandra spoke about earlier that Sheikh Arslan was alluding to. DNR means do not resuscitate, meaning that if I am to go into a position where they would have to resuscitate me by artificial means, which would be, of course, they would provide the shocks, or they would manually resuscitate a person can give a DNR, which is do not resuscitate me order. Sister Sandra, do you want to talk about the legal perspective briefly, and then we'll chime in on the Islamic perspective, please?
Yes. So this is something that has to be signed by a physician. This is paperwork that you can obtain from the hospital whether it's for hospice, and the paperwork has to be signed by your physician because it is his signature indicates, although indicates that a DNR is in place. If that is not signed and if it is not in place, they will do CPR. And if you're 80 or 90 years old in a nursing home, I've seen, a rigorous, effect of breaking ribs on older patients. And it's for someone, I think in the 80, 90 age range, I think a DNR, in my personal opinion, is something to think is a positive thing to put in place, because recovering from your ribs being broken at that age is such a long recovery.
So this takes us to the discussion, and Sister Sandra, that a DNR is a legal document, correct? And that is something that you get signed by a physician. And this is something that would come under the topic of a advance directive. Advance directive means it's something that before that issue transpires, you as a human being provide an advance directive. That means that you create either a document or you note it or document it verbally, maybe a voice recording or something else. And that advance directive, which is a document or instructions that you give as a human being to your families, can include a DNR that, look, if I fall into a coma or if I have a massive heart attack, I don't want to go in a state of agitation. So if something goes south per se and things get worse, I would instruct that I would not be resuscitated. Rather, I would leave it to the will of Allah and let my soul depart if that's the case. Now, Sister Sandra, advance directives. Did I cover that adequately, or do you feel there's something that was missing from that before I hit the Islamic aspect of it?
Well, all of it, under the terminology of advance directives are several different forms. So the one is the DNR. The second is the medical power of attorney. This is when you have someone in your family who you designate to take medical decisions for you. This again has to be signed and has to have a physician sign that. Or actually, in fact, you have to have an attorney to. Apologize. There's not for the medical power of attorney. You have to have someone in your family that you choose who will make medical decisions for you. Under that is the power of attorney. The power of attorney is the one that needs an attorney, which is dealing with your assets, your property, your belongings that to be distributed. And then underneath that, you have a willed, this is a last will and testament. This last will, again, is when the patient does not want, I think I have a slide coming up for this, but it's when the patient is making a decision, a last conversation, a last statement with their physician, asking for what they will to happen. For example, they may say to the physician, I don't want to be on life support. When my time comes, if you see this photo here, where this is a life support. Someone is on life support in ICU, and these are the tents they're putting around COVID patients. They kind of try to take extra precaution for patients. So if you don't want life support, which sometimes people can be on life support for 180 days, this is when you are living in a machine is keeping you alive. It is not the natural way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen for us to die. This is a measure that they put in place. And once you have been intubated and you are put on this machine, and it's up to the parent, it's up to the children to make a decision whether they want to take you off this machine. And it's so complicated for families because they feel they don't want to be the one to make that decision. They don't want the burden of responsibility. They don't want the burden of choice. So the last statement and the last will and statement is when you as a patient say to your physician, I don't want to be on life support. This way your family is not having to make that decision for you.
Well, I'm sorry if I can interject, Sister Sandra and Imam Azhar. I understand, that oftentimes the family doesn't want to make that decision for the person who is ill. So the recommendation that you are making is that people should put in an advance directive where they make that decision about themselves and not put their family members in that dilemma when they are in the ICU. But the problem is that the person who is signing or who's working on that advance directive, they themselves don't know. I myself, how do I decide whether I would want to be on life support or not? So that same dilemma that the family is faced with, the person himself is faced with, he doesn't know whether he should have a DNR, he should not have a DNR. And that's where I think your advice would become crucial, both of you.
Well, just to chime on that, Sister Sandra, before you, an advance directive isn't a hard and fast document that cannot be changed. An advance directive can be changed and continue to evolve with time. Even if you are in the hospital and you let, as Sister Sandra said, you let the doctor know at that time because the circumstances are real now. The scenario is happening. Before, when you give an advance directive, it's like, okay, if I get into this position, don't resuscitate me, or don't put me on life support, don't revive, whatever. People say these things because realistically, there's no natural scenario occurring at that moment. But Allah forbid, if something like that happens and you had an advance directive, you can change it so long you are able to speak, you're cognizant, you can make those changes, and the doctors have to follow that. If you, for example, appointed your son, that my son will decide, or this certain physician will decide, your word supersedes them in the case that you're able to talk. Now, that comes down to the point when you're not able to talk, listen, or respond for yourself. That's where, as Sister Sandra said, it becomes a very difficult situation because families are put in a position where if there's no clarity, if there's no common ground and understanding, which an advance directive would give, and that's why many Muslim physicians emphasize that everyone, irrespective that you're elderly or young, if you are able to think for yourself and speak for yourself and articulate what it is that you want, an advance directive gives some level of a foundation on which the family can work. There's so many scenarios where family members came in odds when it came down to that crucial moment, and it was the bickering between the family member that now has left that loved one in a nursing home or on life support machine because they couldn't agree on what should be the route forward. So a discussion of death, right? Sheikh Arslan goes down to, that we should remember death frequently. And this comes under that terminology that you're constantly aware of the fact that things could change and you want to make the best decision both now and at that time, so it doesn't cause confusion, it doesn't cause rift, and it doesn't cause division in the family. Sister Sandra?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. That's exactly what is happening, is that families are coming together, they're bickering. And you think that death can either bring out the best in someone or bring out the worst. And we find a lot of times that the dynamics of in a hospital are sometimes getting consensus among the family members who are all having a different point of view in terms of these advance directive or medical, who's going to be medical power of attorney, and then sometimes it's too late to make those decisions.
So exactly, the thing is,
another
Sister Sandra,
point for
sorry, go
acute
ahead.
care is that you can put. I was going to say you can put measures in place and say, well, if I'm going to be on life support for 180 days, then I definitely don't want that. That's not an existence. And my loved ones are waiting outside of the hospital, waiting, and every day they're in agony and they're stressing about what happened today and what's going to happen. And you can say, if it's more than this frame of time, you can choose to say, if I have 3 or 4 comorbidities, if I have, you're finding yourself in what kind of condition that you may possibly be in order for yourself not to be on life support. If you're a young person who has a whole life ahead of you, would be a lot different than someone who is elderly, or someone who has many other illnesses that are in addition to the reason why they're.
And Sister Sandra, so for example, correct me if I'm wrong, if you don't have advance directives, the state can then make a decision on your behalf. Is that correct?
Well, if you have family members, of course, they're going to speak to your family members first. But the advance directive and medical power attorneys at this moment currently are being done through teletherapy. So telechaplaincy. So if somebody is calling and they want to put some advance directive immediately in place, they're doing this through the telechaplaincy. If there's nothing that's in place, then they would initially go to the family. At least in hospice, they'll go to the family. They'll try to get family members to make a decision, choose someone to be a medical power attorney, do the paperwork through telechaplaincy.
And so, the one thing I want to talk about here, just briefly, Sister Sandra, and is the reality of our current situation. For those of you who don't know, with every passing year, the number of families are going down percentage-wise, and the number of people living single lives is steadily growing. So we're coming to a time within the next decade or two, people won't have family members that they can turn to. They may have family members alive, but distant, and foreign at times. And so that's when things get very difficult. See, there's a concept in our Islam of ummah and community, and that community brings unity, and that unity helps our families become stronger. The family unit is the backbone of our religion and the continuity of our religion. And it seems that we are seeing new trends emerge, and that's where it gets scary. And, even if you have family members, Sister, I want to give you a personal story here. I was in Florida where I was working as an imam for the first 5.5 years in Fort Myers, and there was a snowbird couple that was there from a northern state, and he had a heart attack. He went in. He had a surgery, and after the surgery, he went into a coma. And the doctor stated that if he does survive, chances are he might be in a vegetative state. Now, this is a graphic story for those who are listening, but I think it's a very important one because this will take us into this topic here. What happens Islamically when a person is nearing death? And I want to kind of move on because there's so much to discuss in a few of these steps, and inshallah in the future we'll be actually expanding on these stories and on these topics, because they are very important topics. So one is that you give advance directive. Now these are elderly couple. Unfortunately, he didn't give those advance directives. Number two, there was a difference within the spouses, right? Him being the husband, she being the wife. There was a difference both in their faiths. There was a difference in their outlook. So what happened was I went to visit him at the hospital, Health Park Hospital, and he wasn't doing well. Went to see him, pray with him, talk to his wife, and the wife was adamant, just take the life support machine off and let it be. And Allah forgive me for assuming, but to me, I felt as if she really didn't want this thing to continue. She just didn't care much, unfortunately. I stressed with her. I said, look, there's a few days. Let's pray. Let's wait on what the doctors say. The brainstem was something that I look at. I talk to doctors. What's the function of the brainstem? What is the possibility of the person coming through? Sometimes the doctors say things are stable. We don't know yet. We'll need 72 hours to see. Again, it's a case-by-case scenario. And that's how our Islam fits in so well, because there's not one size fits all in our Islam. We look at circumstances and cases and go accordingly. So subhanallah, I told her, let's wait till Friday and let's pray on Friday and then we'll talk. I just finished the Jummah prayer and she called me and she said, we're pulling the plug. I said, please don't. And she said, no, we're going to. I said, give me 40 minutes. So I was going to take my father home, drop him off and go to the hospital. My father said, let's just go. We went to the hospital. By the time we got there, Sister Sandra, and to our audience and Sheikh Arsalan, they were pulling the life support machine out. And it was a very haunting scenario for me. And my father himself states, and my father, mashallah, is in his 80s now, he said that it made him sick to his stomach because by the door, the wife is standing and she's saying, go, go, Allah loves you, go home, go home. And he, of course, did not know what was happening. And the nurse who extracted, the life support machine, the tube in his trachea in his throat, there was another nurse holding his hands. And I said to her respectfully, said, please don't touch him because you're not mahram. And number two, this is not the Islamic way. She tried to do some prayer. I said, I am praying and I'm praying quietly. So again, there was that educational factor that needed to be done. Long story short, he had a Quran in his right hand that his wife or someone had put, and I was standing on his left side and I was holding his hand. And as soon as they extracted the machine that helped his lungs, he woke up. He was grasping for air, and he tried to comprehend where he was. I tried to speak to him. There was no family member. His wife left. She literally went to the waiting room. I told the nurses to leave. My father and I were there, and I was talking to him and explaining to him, and he was crying. And he grasped my hand. I recited kalima with him, and it's so sad to know that you have family, but at this time you have no family. And at that time we were with him. He was trying to breathe. It was close to almost Asr time was going. My father saying, let's run downstairs, pray Asr at the chapel, sorry. Come upstairs and we'll continue standing with him because he had no one there. We ran downstairs, we prayed Asr like a flash, ran back upstairs, he passed. At that time, I went to sit with his wife to console her, and she was like, you know what, I'm not going to call back home, meaning not northern state. The children were in another country. I won't name the country. She goes, right now they're sleeping. I'll wait till I wake up till I call them. I then asked her, what do you want the masjid to do? What do you want us to do here? She said, nothing. We're just going to ship his body back. And again, there's so much that we can unpack here and so many conversations that could emerge from this. But in respect of time of the audience and our participants, let's go into this thing. What happens? What do we do Islamically when someone is nearing death? Now, not at all times will we be able to have an imam, a learned person by our side to direct us. So what do we do Islamically? Well, Islamically, the first thing we need to do is ensure that the family members are there. And the family members, I always tell them to communicate with their loved one, maybe their husband or wife, their mother or father, whoever it may be, that you communicate with them and you clear any air that may be there. So just say they are on life support machine. I tell them, sit down next to them, talk to them, ask for apology. Whatever you wanted to get off your chest, you do that because it's important for you to do it now, then carry the guilt of not having those conversations tomorrow. So this is one thing the family member should do. Ask for forgiveness, express that they have forgiven the individual. And then inshallah, depending on, again, scenario that I'm giving, the person's on life support machine or their situation is drastically deteriorating, at that time you would recite kalima and keep a positive environment. Keep in mind, Islamically, they're going to be seeing the angel of death very soon. And the next realm, the next world is going to open before them and the transition is going to occur. And many a times, including the case of the brother who I just told you, and the case of someone whose bedside I was at just recently, a few months ago when they passed, is that they would look towards a certain direction. Their eyes would become fixated, is because that's where the angel of death is coming from. And you recite the kalima. Of course, we are saddened, we are shocked, we are hurt, we are grieving that our loved one is going to die. But to give them that encouragement and spiritual support, you recite the kalima. How do you do talqeen, as they call it, reciting the kalima? You don't grab them or yank them and say la ilaha illallah. You recite it so that they are also able to recite it. Sometimes, of course, especially if they have the machine in their mouth, they're intubated, they won't be able to recite it. But many times they will move their hands or do some gesture that indicates that they're responsive and they know what you're saying. This is one of the most important things from the Islamic perspective. Sorry, I'm talking so much. Sister Sandra, do you want to chime in here about Islamic perspective? As I know, mashallah, you've been in these scenarios much more than I have. Is there something you want to share with us?
Yes, very much so. Again, when these patients are intubated, we think, or they're in a coma. It's often that people will think, oh, they can't hear, they're not with us, they're in a vegetable state. And I had a patient who was in a coma for 3 months, and her family members were coming and they were planning her funeral, and they were talking about what funeral home and where they're going to bury her, and sort of just were waiting for her to die. And then she came out of the coma, and she was so angry at her family for preparing her death, and talking about her as if she was not there, and planning her death and planning the funeral. And so again and again, I in this case, we're in a new situation with COVID, but again, not to speak in front of a patient. If your loved one is in your home and you're caring for them, not to, just because they may be in a coma or they're intubated, doesn't mean that they're not able to hear or to comprehend. They just can't speak, but they are aware. And we don't know how much awareness. Each case is individual, but that was just one case I was aware of, where the patient told me this story, and how painful it was, and the relationships between her and her family broke after that because of the things that were said. There was more than just the burial, but just things that they said in front of the patient, thinking that she's on a life machine, that she can't hear. That's one piece. But going back to what you spoke of initially, is that, yes, speaking of, sometimes I bring in an iPad with Quran on it, or take an app where they can listen to Quran, even if they're intubated. Sometimes they, reciting Surah Yasin and Ayat al-Kursi, and just doing dhikr, depending on what condition they're in, and sometimes preparing them for the questions that the angels will be asking them, so that they are aware and that they're thinking of the world to come. I have also witnessed, like you mentioned, Imam Azhar, where many patients will be looking to a side of a room, and as if they're witnessing the angel coming to take them, and you'll see their eyes transfixed in a corner, and it's that moment where they're exiting and entering
Correct, and it's truly.
the world of souls.
Sorry, please continue.
Just be focused on that just focus on on that one location. And even though there's loved ones in the room, they are already transitioning and they're witnessing. So preparing them for that journey, preparing them for that next transition and that process, and preparing them for what they may have to speak. I mean, we also know that in that space, it's a different physics. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow some of us to speak and some of us won't be able to speak. We don't know, but I mean, you think of the body going into the earth and the brain and the memory. Well, then where's the memory that's going to answer those questions in the grave? Is that the soul that's going to answer those questions? Does the soul have a memory? But the idea is to prepare and to say the questions of, who is your God, and who is the prophet, and, what is your religion, and how do you know that from the Quran? Because in the Quran, God teaches us who is He, and God teaches us who is our prophet, and God teaches us our religion. So preparing them, I think, is important to make them feel some kind of sakina, some kind of preparation for that.
Mr. Sandra, so nice what you just said, because you're talking about how family members should be cognizant and aware of the reality of what's happening with their family member, loved one in this state, and what they should do as family members. Be supportive. Don't talk things that will hurt them. Their senses are there. They may not be able to open their eyes, but they're listening. They may not be able to speak, but they're comprehending. It's so important that we are aware of these things. The fixation of the eyes, the pulse shooting up and then just dropping steadily until it just borderlines. There's so many things that will happen. And we all, my fellow Muslims and viewers, we all have to prepare for this, because we may be burying our loved ones before other loved ones will bury us. It all goes down to who's going first and who's going next. At the same time, Sister Sandra, I want to touch on one thing, because we're talking about advanced directives initially and do not resuscitate and all these other measures, which are documents or legal terminologies that are used. Islamically, is that permissible? So yes, it is permissible to prepare advanced directives. It is permissible to create a framework of resuscitate, do not resuscitate, which can, again, it's fluid. It can be changed based upon different circumstances that occur throughout the course of time until the person's in that position and able to make the last decision for themselves before that handing over of decision-making goes to their family members. And according to the Fatwa Council the Fatwa Council of Singapore, the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, there's a fatwa that they gave in 1994 about advanced directives and how it is permissible in Islam. And the basis that they used for that tradition was, for that ruling, was the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in which a lady came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, pray to Allah for her recovery. And the Prophet ﷺ said, if you are patient, the reward that awaits you is heaven, or if you wish otherwise, I shall pray to Allah for your recovery. The woman then replied that, she would then be patient. So again, these things were not happening back in those days. It's a whole different world, of course, but we can kind of connect to certain scenarios that happened then to bring forth perspective and understanding for what we see right now. So for those of you who are saying, is it okay Islamically? Yes, it is. Number two, do I need to do it? Everyone needs to. And especially under these circumstances. And I want to change this topic a little bit, Sister Sandra, and bring in another point, which is important: the responsibility of the patient himself or herself. So again, we talked about family members and their duty and responsibility to a loved one, but what is the responsibility of the patient to the family? Now, sometimes people start getting indications of deteriorating health. At that time, it's important, as Sister Sandra said in the beginning, to ensure that a will is in place, power of attorney, assets are kind of defined, because when a person fails to do that, they can be held accountable on Day of Judgment before Allah for the chaos that's caused because of it. And I'll give you just a recent scenario. A very close friend of mine, father was diagnosed with cancer, was going through cancer treatment, thought he would die initially because of it. Hamda, 3-4 treatments in, it was looking stable. But he sat his family down, and the dynamics of the family was kind of peculiar. It was different. But he sat everyone down to talk about his assets, to talk about distribution and everything else. But he didn't get around to finalizing it. Of course, the family would always feud that, what's this, what's that, why theirs, why not mine? So there was that discussion ongoing, and all under which he just said, forget it, I'm not going to do this right now. And lo and behold, that weekend, he caught COVID. And within 3 days, he passed. And until now, it's been a few months, the family is still arguing and they're bickering over it. And the imam that he was thinking of appointing, and that imam then came in, that imam then got so tired, he said, I'm not going to be a part of this. So the point is, all of you, as Rasulullah said, kullukum ra'in, all of you are responsible, and all of you will be asked about those who are under you. If you have assets, if you have properties, if you have possessions, you should have all that documented somewhere where your family knows it, and that in a time of passing, they'll be able to understand it. To create a will where you tell that my property and assets, which are enumerated here, would be distributed according to Islamic law, whatever else. And yes, you can do that. You can have your assets distributed according to Islamic law, according to Sharia, according to the mirath calculation method. It can be done. But you have to articulate that. You have to define that, because if you don't do that, you leave the family, number one, confused as to what was their father's or their mother's belongings, and number two, who gets what. Sister Sandra, I spoke again too much. Do you want to chime in on this, please?
I agree 100%, Imam Azhar. I think as I said before, that death sometimes brings out the best and the worst in family members, and without having something in place that they may even have to initiate themselves, even if they're doing it privately with an imam, or they're doing it privately, something that they're leaving. It's called a living will. That living will is their last testaments. Often it's made between, it can be made between you and your physician. I mean, it sort of, having something in place sets precedent for families so that they can behave accordingly when the time comes near and they know that they're going to lose their loved one. I find that there's more chaos in the end of decedent care and then families coming united. This has been across, because in America, what I have found also is that many families will have a child in California and in Florida and New York, and all of a sudden their loved one is here in Texas, and they're waiting for all these different siblings to come who fly in. And they live separate lives, they live different lives. And I have found that the majority of my patients are not always non-Muslim are not always religious or have a strong faith. So when it comes to the end of life care, the families are not getting along, and this makes it more difficult because when the patient can witness that in ICU, where they see family members not getting along, this puts extra stress onto the patient. They are uncomfortable. You can see them wincing and moving, and they're very sensitive. They can sense what's happening in the air, and they can sense from the tone and from the communications that the loved ones are not getting along. And in terms of hearing, one of the last things that goes of our senses is our hearing. Again, so I usually will ask families, I'll say, can we take that to a private room and we'll discuss, or can you not discuss that in front of your parent or your loved one, and ask them to take the conversation to another space so that the loved one doesn't have to endure the stress of family members. Now with COVID, the new situation is that people are not allowed to go into the hospitals. They can't see their loved ones, and it's very, very painful. And what's happening is sometimes even the chaplains themselves, or could be the priests who may be in fear, will not go into the rooms as well. So sometimes we don't know if these patients are dying alone. Nurses have told me that they will go and they will stay with the patient, but there's too many times that they don't have anyone with them when they're dying. This is very important that these patients are dying alone.
Sister Sandra, Jazakallah khairan. I want you to continue, inshallah. Imam Azhar had to leave because it's time for Isha in the masjid, so he has to lead the prayer. But I have your presentation open. I hope you can see that as well. And why don't you just continue and walk us along the presentation, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Brother Arsalan. So these are a couple of the new styles of giving care to patients. The teledoc, which you may be familiar with, the Epic Visit, where they have a video that now, or an iPad. Sometimes the telechaplaincy will come in and they will just pull up an iPad, and either from their home or in the hospital, but not going in to see patients, especially COVID patients, and they will just communicate with them through the technical devices, even through telephone. They will have an iPhone that belongs to the patient that stays in the room, and the iPhone is the device that they use and they keep in the room the entire time and communicate with the patient through their iPad. But it really depends on the chaplain. Certain hospitals, for example, I was speaking to someone today who's from Methodist, who told me that they're leaving it up to the chaplains if they want to go in or don't want to go in once they've gotten their inoculation. But it's really a chaplain's discretion. Baylor doesn't allow any chaplains to visit COVID patients, but they will allow them to visit non-COVID patients. Each hospital is following a different protocol, but Children's is the hospital which I was the most impressed with. They have not changed any of their protocols due to COVID. They don't have a big flow of a big capacity of deaths because they're children, but they go in the rooms and they have done everything according to the way things were prior to COVID. They have not changed anything. But again, it depends where you are in the country. It depends on your governor. Governor of Arkansas is not allowing anybody to go in from anywhere in the hospitals, whether they're chaplains or volunteers, family. So it really depends on your state and depends on the policies of the hospital. I was happy to see that Texas has a little bit more open attitude about having chaplains or having They have 2 priests that are allowed for each hospital. That's another option, to the same 2 priests all the time.
Sister Sandra, if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to an earlier slide. If you can also speak a little bit more about some of these things here, especially the second and third question.
Yeah, what families should be aware of during this time. So again, they should be aware of what the procedures are in their hospital, making sure that their name is on the list. In addition to the list, sometimes like a Presbyterian hospital, not only do you have to have your name on the list, and there can only be 2 people, 2 family members, but you have to get a COVID test every 72 hours. So that dynamic is that you can see your family, and then you, after every 72 hours, you have to get the COVID test before you can get back into the hospital to visit. In addition to that, you also have to have an appointment. If you don't have an appointment, they won't let you in. So each hospital seems to have a different procedure and a different dynamic. Basically, it's 1 or 2 people can go once a day, but then the dynamics change sometimes in depending on whether the patient is COVID or not. Currently, another thing to think about is the decedents. Some hospitals have a 24-hour policy of picking up the decedent once they have passed. They don't have a morgue capacity. There is an overflow where FEMA has offered some trucks to put an overflow of patients in the trucks, but mostly these morgues are not big enough to hold the capacity, so they're having the funeral home pick up the patient within 24 hours. These are challenging times because sometimes people don't have jobs. Sometimes people are not financially capable of taking care of their decedent. So the hospitals try to work with them, but they really need to keep a flow going of getting the people picked up from the morgue. So that's something to think about, choosing a funeral home that you wanted to work with. Now, what I understand with Rahma Funeral Home, which is here, this is the only Muslim funeral home that is in North Texas. And I spoke with Brother Kazi a couple of days ago, and now he does not wash the bodies. He just puts them in a you have the body bag, and then he puts them in another body bag, and then he puts them in the coffin and then in the grave. Houston and Chicago are washing the bodies. So I think you have to think about, you have that 24-hour period to make a decision. Obviously, we only have Rahma Funeral Home, so that would be the funeral home for us. I think preparing for, if you have a loved one, if they're going to go to Restland, or if they're going to go to which cemetery to purchase a plot, or to be aware of a plot, or where you're choosing if this is the case. I know there's also a situation where sometimes family want to send the decedent back home to Pakistan.
Sister Sandra, I'm sorry, I'm surprised to hear that Houston and Chicago, they are washing bodies of the deceased who died from COVID.
Yes, that's correct.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's a decision of the funeral director, the funeral home. It's, I think we always tell our funeral directors, if we have a patient who has AIDS or has hepatitis C or some communicable disease, we will say, take universal precautions. That's the terminology, universal precautions. But with COVID, across the board, it is legally appropriate to say this patient has COVID. So you would tell the funeral director from any denomination that the patient has COVID, so that they're aware. Now, it's up to the funeral director himself how he wants to proceed. If the going to embalm with the Christians, if the rabbis are going to take the same avenue as we do, which is to bury the decedent within 24 hours. But I was just informed the practices and protocols of Rahma Funeral Home, but again, it's their choice to do that. So I think that that's something to be aware of as a family member. If that's something that you feel strongly about and want to do that, that's a procedure that you can put in place. I do know Islamically, you are allowed to wash the body in your home if you wanted to do that prior to calling the funeral home, if you're removing it from your home. So that's an option also for families to think about.
Yes, and there have been families,
loved one.
there have been families in DFW who have chosen to do that with their loved ones who died from COVID. They did the washing at home. So yes, you're right. That is an option that people have if they choose to do so. Can you also talk about this last question, Sister Sandra? Who is allowed to see them?
So in this situation, if you're in the hospital, as I said earlier, that Clemens is allowing only 5 family members to see their loved one. If we had to send one family member or choose between the 6 of the family of the children, because only 5 could come in. That is a rule they have in place. There are some conditions where if you have a nurse manager who is more flexible and she's controlling that floor, she may say, make some exceptions at some time, but it really is something that they frown upon, having a lot of people coming into the hospital to see the decedent. Children's Hospital, again, has not changed any of their protocols, and the protocols they have is that anyone and any family member, they don't care if they're 10 family members or 15 family members, they can go in to see the decedent. In terms of a funeral home, that is usually the family's responsibility, again, to set that up. That is not done by the hospital or the chaplains. But the key is that most hospitals are saying a 24-hour period. It depends across the board which hospital you're dealing with. You may want to ask them, do you have a time frame? Because when the patient dies, obviously they cannot pass the virus on to you because they're deceased. So there's not as much as a threat to keep the body in the morgue. So if there's 2 or 3 days, I know in Chicago, they allow you to keep the body in the decedent in the morgue for 3 days. Again, that's a conversation you want to have with the hospital.
Okay, very good. Sister Sandra, I think we do need to wrap up, but before we end the program, I really did want you to speak a little bit. I know we spoke about advanced directives at the beginning of the program. We also talked about power of attorney and DNRs. If you could talk a little bit more about the will and the difference between a living will and a personal will.
Okay, again, the living will, that last statement, that is between you and your physician. That's a conversation that the patient says, look, I know that if I'm going to be on life support, for 6 months or 8 months or a year, and I don't want to put my family through that stress, and if I'm that ill, I would prefer not to be on life support. So the patient has this conversation with the doctor. They call it a last statement. They call it a living will. They're interchangeable, but this is just between the patient and the physician. And this is important because, again, it takes that responsibility and burden off the family members who are in crisis and chaos at the end of life and can't really make a decision of what is the right thing to do. And I've had family members come in and say, oh, we think it's time to pull the plug. And we just think it's too much. And someone else in the family will say, no, we need to wait. We need to be patient. We need to wait. We don't know. Anything can happen. We just have to pray. And so there was a point in the hospital, we had a patient on life support for 180 days, and the patient and the physicians were sort of encouraging the chaplains, can you help the family to make a decision, because, we need to do something. That's a very long period of time of having a patient here for 180 days. So it's a sensitive time, and sometimes just having the conversation as we are this evening is so critical in the family, so that you are actually speaking about sensitive topics that you don't want to happen or don't anticipate happening, but at least having a conversation is empowering people to make decisions that might be necessary when it's necessary. The time is near.
Thank you so much, Sister Sandra. One last question. I think it would be a good way to conclude this program. And I know that we touched on this earlier, but I think just to emphasize this point again, if you could give some advice to our viewers how to start having this conversation with their family.
Well, I think, subhanAllah, the fact that COVID is here, the fact that we are in a crisis, the fact that we are Muslims, and one of the concerns I think is paramount is the fact that we are Muslims who want to die in a Muslim space. We are Muslims who want to die where we feel we have Muslims around us. I think it's critical to speak about the fact that because of COVID, and we don't know who and when and where, or if we may be exposed, this is very important to share with our loved ones, that how we want to look at that time for ourselves. Another important thing is we don't know what it's like in these hospitals. They have crosses on the walls. Patients want to see Islamic calligraphy on the walls. They want to hear the Quran. They want to feel safe having Muslim nurses around them, or professionals or physicians. I think that, we're in the West. We are not in Muslim countries. And this is one of the challenges we have. And I feel it's very, very important to have a Muslim hospital. I know that's a huge endeavor taking upon, in our society. But I mean, if not that, why not just a Muslim space, so that the people can come from the hospital and we bring them to a space like a nursing home, or a space where they can pass amongst their own community, some kind of center, some kind of small space that Muslims can, die in a Muslim space. I think I have had patients in the hospital when I was working at St. Paul, and there was crosses that were on the walls, and they were nailed into the wall. And the patient was so uncomfortable, and I had to ask maintenance to come remove it, and they couldn't take the cross off. And then they had to really use a crowbar to get the cross off for that patient.
Would they allow the patient's family to at least cover it up with a cloth or something like that?
And this in St. Paul, UT Southwestern, they had them because it was a original Catholic facility. And you have to remember, Methodists, some hospitals, again, something for families to think about, where you don't always choose where your loved one goes if it's an emergency. Sometimes they're sent to a private, depending on what the situation is. If they're closer to one private hospital based on their insurance. But for example, some of the newer hospitals are not putting these symbols on their walls. But when I think about that particular patient I had, it was very hard to remove that cross. We finally got the cross off. She was very, very relieved. And these are important things. I mean, you think the angels are going to come, and they don't want to see a cross on a wall. These angels are coming in to take our soul, and these are sensitive issues that we don't think about unless we're in these situations. And I again, Muslims in the West, we need a space for ourselves. We need a Muslim space for us to.
Sister Sandra, I'm back. Jazakumullah khairan. Sheikh Arslan, thank you so much. I just want to chime in what I just heard from you. There are challenges, right? There are challenges wherever we go in the world. The one thing that we see right now happening in the UK is that a lot of Muslim scholars who have graduated from Islamic, institutions are now doing chaplaincy work in jails, hospitals. Some are working alongside government. And the point is that we as a Muslim community need to have exposure in all realms, and especially in the hospitals. And sometimes it doesn't cross our mind, that how important it is to have a Muslim chaplain on call until, Allah forbid, we or someone we love is in that situation. And they're like, how come there is no imam here? And the same goes for universities. Like, universities have people of different faith that are there to help students of that particular faith. But you'll see across this nation, if there is a void, it comes from the Muslim community. So alhamdulillah, you have, mashallah, facilitated an Islamic perspective. You've been an Islamic voice, alhamdulillah, for the patients that you've interacted with. A question I'd like to pose here, and I'm sorry, I'm just jumping in here, is that how important is it in your perspective and understanding, irrespective COVID or otherwise, to have Muslim scholarly voices in the hospitals, in the healthcare system?
Thank you so much. That is a brilliant point to make. It is essential, absolutely essential. One of the reasons I went into chaplaincy is because I thought, because I'm a Muslim who came into Islam 30 years ago, I thought, oh, let me get my foot in the door and try to make that difference. Let me try to make that presence in a hospital, that I can be that bridge between the imam and our community, or the Muslims, and sort of meet that demand, because I was thinking about Muslims dying and being buried in 24 hours and thinking, how can we facilitate that? Because usually what I have found in hospitals, you'll find that the nurses, chaplains, everyone will say, what do? We don't know. It's a Muslim. We don't know what to do. And they're sort of like wasting time for the next 6, 7, 10 hours trying to figure out and trying to call a mosque or trying to understand the protocols. But by having the exposure of being around Muslims, you're allowed to give presentations, you're allowed to give education. And that's really critical, is to educate the other chaplains so that they're aware of how to manage if you're not on call or you're not there, what are the resources in the community so that they can get the care for their loved ones. That's really critical and essential. I think that it's important to have someone facilitating on the inside for the outside.
Correct, mashallah. Sheikh Arslan.
Imam Azhar, I know that you're away. Alhamdulillah, Sister Sandra covered a lot of the topics from her PowerPoint presentation while you were away. And actually, we're just about to wrap up. So if we can have some final words from you, Imam Azhar, and maybe a dua to conclude, that would be nice, inshallah.
Sure. Well, first of all, to Sister Zeba Sayed, Sister Zeba Siddiqui, our social service committee here at the Islamic Association of Collin County, our esteemed guest, Sister Sandra, our esteemed resident scholar, Sheikh Arslan. On behalf of the community, I want to thank all of you for facilitating this, for preparing for this, and for delivering this important subject to our community. To the fellow community members here and beyond who are watching this tonight live, and for those who will be watching, inshallah, in the future. The subject matter that we touched upon today is a crucial one, not just in light of the COVID pandemic, but in general, for us to understand the
Uh-oh. Looks like Imam Azhar got dropped from the call. Um, so maybe having some internet issues at the masjid. I'll continue where he was leaving off. Sister Sandra, thank you so much. Jazakallah khairan for taking time out to be with us. I am sure that this is not the last time that we're having you on a program with us. Inshallah, there will be other opportunities. Like Imam Azhar was saying, these are important topics. This was just sort of to get the conversation started. And inshallah, I hope that the Social Services Committee will have more expanded discussions on some of these topics in the future with you and other people from the community as well. Anything you'd like to say before we conclude?
Thank you very much for just all the effort put in to do a program like this for our community. I think that the initial step of just having this dialogue is a way of inviting people who are in their homes or listening and watching to have that dialogue at home and to really know that this is, we are in a new normal that, and we have to know how to navigate and with leadership like your brother Arslan and Imam Azhar, I think these are the steps that need to be taken into, so that we can help our community to unite on the appropriate steps to take as a community. So thank you very, very much. I'm honored to be here. I appreciate it.
Jazakallah khairan. For those of our viewers who may not be aware of the Social Services Committee, this is a very important committee that we have at IACC. You can learn more about it by going to the Plano Masjid website, planomasjid.org, and you'll see a menu on the top for services, and you'll see social services underneath it. There are many services that are provided under this umbrella. So I encourage you to explore that. And if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can email Imam Azhar at imam@planomasjid.org, or you can email me at resident.scholar@planomasjid.org. Thank you. Jazakumullahu khairan. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us all prepare for our next abode. Death is a topic that nobody likes to talk about, nobody likes to hear about, but we are all certain that it's going to come to us sooner or later. So it behooves us to prepare for that day as individuals, as families, and it is a transition from this world into our final abode where we all have to go. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He makes us people who are focused on that at all times, people who live in this world for the next world. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant mercy and forgiveness to those in our family who have passed away. And for the rest of us who are still here, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make the best of our days the day when we meet Him, the best and happiest of our days when we meet Him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us a sincere repentance before we die. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us comfort and forgiveness when we die. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enter us into His gardens of paradise after we die. Ameen. Ya Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallillahumma wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum.